The story of Michel Foucault's philosophy does not begin with a single epiphany, nor does it spring from an isolated laboratory of thought. It unfurls from a turbulent intellectual climate that stretched from the dying embers of 19th century pessimism to the fevered experiments of mid-20th century structuralism. To understand the roots of his work, we must first listen to the echoes of three towering voices that haunted the French university halls in the decades before he arrived: Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, and Emile Durkheim. Each of them offered a different map of the terrain that Foucault would later traverse: Nietzsche, with his genealogical excavation of morals; Heidegger, with his phenomenological analysis of being; and Durkheim, with his insistence that social life could be measured like any natural phenomenon. Their ideas intersected, collided, and ultimately formed a crucible in which a young scholar from Poitiers would forge a new way of seeing power, knowledge, and the self. Nietzsche's influence is perhaps the most immediate and, in many ways, the most intimate. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche writes, "What does your conscience say? It is the voice of a collective that has been made into a voice of the individual." This provocative claim, that morality is not a timeless, universal law but a historical stratification of power relations, resonated with a generation of French intellectuals who were searching for a way to move beyond the grand narratives of the Enlightenment. Nietzsche's method was not to construct a system, but to dissect one, to trace the contingent origins of values that most people take for granted. He called this process genealogy, a term that would later become a central tool in Foucault's own arsenal. When Foucault later wrote in the Archaeology of Knowledge that the task of the historian is to ask what conditions of possibility make a statement thinkable, he was echoing Nietzsche's insistence that every claim carries within it a hidden lineage of power and desire. Heidegger, meanwhile, offered a different kind of excavation. In Being and Time, he famously declares, "We are thrown into the world, and we are always already in a context that we did not choose." Heidegger's analysis of Dasein, human existence as fundamentally situated, challenged the Cartesian view of the subject as a detached, rational observer. Instead, he emphasized that our understanding of ourselves is always mediated by the world, by language, by history. For Foucault, this phenomenological insight became a stepping stone toward what he would later call the historicity of the subject. Heidegger's notion that the meaning of being is always already bound up with the historical horizon opened a door for Foucault to question not only what we know, but how the very conditions of knowing are produced by discursive formations that shift over time. Durkheim, the founding father of French sociology, contributed yet another strand to the tapestry. In the Rules of Sociological Method, he argues that social facts are things, insisting that collective phenomena, law, religion, morality, possess an existence that is external to and coercive over the individual. Durkheim's insistence on the objectivity of social structures gave French scholars a methodological template for treating society as a field of forces that could be measured, mapped, and explained. Foucault would later adopt this empirical rigor, but he would also turn it on its head, showing that the things Durkheim described are themselves products of specific regimes of knowledge. In Madness and Civilization, for instance, Foucault treats madness not as a natural biological condition, but as a social fact that emerges only when certain discourses and institutions align to label, confine, and manage those who deviate from normative standards. It is within this intellectual crucible that Michel Foucault entered the École Normale Supérieure in 1946, a place where the reverberations of Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Durkheim were palpable in every lecture hall. The ENS, with its elite status and its tradition of producing philosophers, historians, and literary critics, was also a hotbed of political activism. The young Foucault, born in Poitiers in 1926, arrived with a background that was both provincial and cosmopolitan. He had studied philosophy in the lycées of Poitiers and later at the University of Lille, where he encountered the works of Sartre and the early Marxist currents that were shaping French intellectual life. At the ENS, he found himself surrounded by a generation that was eager to interrogate the very foundations of Western thought, a generation that would later be known as the New Left of the 1950s and 60s. One of Foucault's earliest and most formative encounters was with Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist who dominated post-war French philosophy. Sartre's lecture on existentialism is a humanism proclaimed that man is condemned to be free, a bold affirmation that each individual bears total responsibility for their choices, even in the face of absurdity. For a young Foucault, Sartre's emphasis on individual agency and freedom was both inspiring and limiting. He admired the existentialist's moral seriousness, yet he sensed a blind spot. Sartre's focus on the autonomous subject seemed to ignore the deeper, often invisible structures that shape what choices appear possible in the first place. This tension would later become a defining fissure in Foucault's own thought. Equally significant was Foucault's exposure to Louis Althusser's structural Marxism. Althusser's For Marx, 1965, argued that ideology functions as a material practice that interpellates individuals as subjects. He wrote, "Ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence." Althusser's insistence on the structural determinants of consciousness resonated with Durkheim's sociological objectivity, but it also clashed with Sartre's existential freedom. Foucault found himself drawn to Althusser's rigorous analysis of how institutions reproduce power, yet he was unsettled by Althusser's deterministic bent, which seemed to reduce human agency to a mere effect of underlying economic structures. These intellectual cross-currents converged in Foucault's first major scholarly undertaking, his 1961 doctoral thesis, Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason. The thesis, later published as a book, is a vivid illustration of how Nietzsche's genealogy, Heidegger's historicity, and Durkheim's social facts coalesce in Foucault's method. The work begins with a striking anecdote about the Great Confinement of the 17th century. Foucault recounts how, in 1650, the French state ordered the closure of the Hôpital Saint-Louis and the subsequent relocation of the insane to the newly built Hôpital Général. He writes, "The Great Confinement was not merely a medical measure. It was a political act that reordered the very limits of what a society could tolerate." By tracing the shifting discourses that define madness, from divine punishment to medical pathology, Foucault demonstrates a genealogical approach that mirrors Nietzsche's technique. He asks not what is madness, but when did madness become a problem and why? In this early work, the influence of Heidegger is palpable in the way Foucault treats the being of madness as historically contingent. He observes that the madman is not a timeless archetype. He is a figure that appears when the conditions of knowledge make his existence thinkable. This Heideggerian sensibility, seeing the subject as always already situated within a horizon of meaning, allows Foucault to argue that the mad is not a natural category, but a product of specific epistemic regimes. Meanwhile, Durkheim's legacy appears in the meticulous archival research Foucault undertakes, treating institutions, legal codes, and medical manuals as social facts that can be mapped and analyzed. He treats the asylum not merely as a building, but as a node in a network of power that exerts a disciplining effect on the broader population. The thesis also contains a moment that foreshadows Foucault's later preoccupation with the relationship between knowledge and power. He quotes the 18th century physician Philippe Pinel, who famously declared, "The patient must be freed from the chains." Foucault notes, however, that Pinel's liberation was accompanied by a new set of clinical observations, measurements, and classifications that turned the patient into an object of scientific scrutiny. The very act of freeing the mad, according to Foucault, was also an act of subjectifying them within a new regime of truth. This paradox, freedom that simultaneously creates a new form of domination, would become a central theme in his later works, especially Discipline and Punish. While the thesis was being defended, the political atmosphere in France was simmering. The Algerian War, 1954-1962, had polarized French society, and the student movement was beginning to coalesce around demands for academic freedom and institutional reform. Foucault, still a graduate student, found himself drawn into these debates. He joined the Comité de Liaison avec les étudiants algériens, an organization that linked French students with Algerian independence activists. This early political engagement was not merely a side note. It shaped his understanding of how power operates not only through institutions, but also through collective action and resistance. The experience of organizing protests, drafting pamphlets, and confronting police repression gave him a lived sense of the micro-politics that he would later theorize. Fast forward to May 1968, a watershed moment that crystallized the tensions between the structuralist optimism of the 1960s and the emerging post-structuralist critique. Foucault, by then a professor at the University of Clermont-Ferrand, was an active participant in the student uprisings that erupted across French campuses. One anecdote from that period stands out. During a protest at the Sorbonne, Foucault climbed onto a balcony and shouted, "We must not simply demand new institutions. We must question the very conditions that make those institutions appear natural." His words echoed the genealogical impulse that had guided his earlier work, an insistence that the naturalness of any social arrangement is always a product of historical contingency. The protest itself was a living laboratory for Foucault's ideas about power as diffuse, relational, and productive rather than merely repressive. He later recalled in an interview, "The barricades were not just walls. They were moments where power was being remade, where new forms of knowledge could emerge. The 1968 protests, therefore, were not simply a political episode. They were a practical demonstration of the concepts he was developing in his writings. In the wake of 1968, the intellectual climate in France shifted dramatically. Structuralism, which had been dominant in the early 1960s, began to show cracks. Thinkers like Claude Lévi-Strauss, Roland Barthes, and Jacques Lacan had demonstrated that language, myth, and the unconscious could be analyzed as systems of signs, independent of the individual subject. This structuralist program promised a scientific rigor akin to the natural sciences, a promise that appealed to scholars weary of existentialist subjectivity. Yet, as the decade progressed, critics began to argue that structuralism, with its emphasis on underlying structures, risked re-inscribing the very determinism it sought to overcome. Enter post-structuralism, a movement that would embrace the instability of meaning, the decentered subject, and the fluidity of power relations. Foucault, with his genealogical method, found himself at the vanguard of this shift. The divergence between Foucault and his contemporaries becomes especially clear when we juxtapose his ideas with those of Sartre and Althusser. Sartre's existentialism, as articulated in Being and Nothingness, posits that existence precedes essence, and that the individual is always free to choose, even in the face of absurdity. Sartre's emphasis on radical freedom and responsibility implies that the primary obstacle to authenticity is bad faith, a self-deception that denies one's freedom. Foucault, however, would argue that the very notion of freedom is produced by specific discourses of power. In the History of Sexuality, he writes, "The self is not a pre-existing entity that can be liberated, it is a product of techniques that make the self possible." From this perspective, Sartre's call for authenticity seems to overlook the ways in which the self is already constituted by power/knowledge regimes. Sartre might respond that Foucault is merely describing the constraints, not offering a path to transcend them. Yet Foucault's counter-argument would be that any transcendence must itself be understood as a technique, a new formation of knowledge that redefines the field of the possible. Althusser's structural Marxism, on the other hand, offered a different point of contention. Althusser argued that the state reproduces the conditions of production through ideological state apparatuses, ISAs, and repressive state apparatuses, RSAs. He famously claimed that ideology is a representation of the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. While Foucault appreciated Althusser's focus on the material mechanisms of ideology, he rejected the idea that these mechanisms could be reduced to a single, underlying economic base. In Discipline and Punish, Foucault writes, "The prison is not simply a site where the law is applied, it is a technology of power that produces docile bodies, and its logic cannot be reduced to the logic of capital." He thus diverged from Althusser by refusing to subordinate all forms of power to a singular economic determinant. Instead, Foucault proposed a genealogy of the present, a method that tracks the emergence of specific techniques of power, such as surveillance, examination, and normalization, across different historical epochs without collapsing them into a monolithic Marxist framework. These disagreements highlight a crucial methodological shift. While Sartre and Althusser each sought a universal principle, existential freedom, or the base superstructure model, Foucault turned to what he called archaeology and later genealogy. The archaeological method, presented in the Archaeology of Knowledge, emphasizes the rules that govern the emergence and disappearance of discursive formations. The genealogical method, inspired by Nietzsche, focuses on the contingent, often violent processes that give rise to those formations. In both cases, Foucault refuses the idea of an immutable essence. He instead asks what conditions made this possible, and what power relations are hidden behind the apparent neutrality of this knowledge. To see this in action, consider two concrete examples from his early work. First, the concept of clinical gaze in The Birth of the Clinic, 1963. Here, Foucault examines the transformation of medical practice in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when physicians began to see the body not as a collection of parts but as a spatial, observable entity within the hospital ward. He writes, "The doctor's eye becomes a machine that produces a new kind of knowledge, and that knowledge, in turn, produces a new kind of patient." This analysis mirrors Nietzsche's genealogical question. What historical conditions allowed the clinical gaze to emerge? The answer lies in the simultaneous rise of statistical thinking, the reorganization of hospitals, and the emergence of a bureaucratic state that demanded standardized records. The clinical gaze thus exemplifies how a seemingly neutral scientific practice is enmeshed in power relations. Second, the notion of panopticism in Discipline and Punish, 1975. Though this work was published later, its roots can be traced back to the early 1960s, when Foucault was still grappling with the legacy of the prison system. He draws on Jeremy Bentham's design of the panopticon, a circular prison where a single guard can observe all inmates without being seen, to illustrate a broader shift in disciplinary power. He argues the panopticon is the diagram of a new mode of power that makes the individual visible, while simultaneously rendering them invisible to themselves. This metaphor demonstrates how surveillance becomes internalized, a concept that would later inform Michel Foucault's ideas about everyday practices and later, Gilles Deleuze's notion of societies of control. The panoptic model, therefore, is not just a description of prisons, but a genealogical account of how modern institutions, from schools to factories, adopted similar techniques of observation and normalization. These examples also reveal how Foucault's early influences manifest in concrete analysis. Nietzsche's skepticism of moral absolutes surfaces in the critique of the civilizing mission of the asylum. Heidegger's focus on historicity appears in the insistence that the mad is a historically contingent figure. Durkheim's sociological rigor shows up in the detailed archival work and the treatment of institutions as social facts. Meanwhile, the structuralist emphasis on underlying systems can be seen in Foucault's mapping of discursive formations, yet his post-structuralist turn, highlighting the fluidity and contingency of those formations, marks his departure from the structuralist paradigm. The rise of structuralism itself provides an essential backdrop. In the early 1960s, French academia was captivated by the promise that language, myth, and the unconscious could be decoded like a code. Lévi-Strauss's The Savage Mind argued that the human mind operates according to universal structures, regardless of cultural differences. Barthes, in Mythologies, showed how everyday objects could be read as signs that reinforced dominant ideologies. This intellectual climate encouraged scholars to search for deep, hidden regularities beneath the surface of culture. Foucault, initially influenced by this milieu, adopted the structuralist habit of looking for underlying systems. Yet he quickly grew uneasy with the structuralist tendency to treat these systems as stable and timeless. His own genealogical work, by contrast, emphasizes rupture, discontinuity, and the role of struggle in producing knowledge. The transition to post-structuralism, which gathered momentum in the late 1960s and early 1970s, offered a more fitting vocabulary for Foucault's insights. Thinkers like Jacques Derrida, with his deconstruction of metaphysical binaries, and Gilles Deleuze, with his concept of desire as production, were questioning the very foundations of structuralist thought. Foucault's own shift from the archaeological to the genealogical mirrored this broader move. He no longer sought to uncover a stable underlying structure. Instead, he traced the historical emergence of power/knowledge configurations, always aware that each configuration contains within it the seeds of its own transformation. In this sense, Foucault's method can be seen as a bridge between structuralism's systematic ambition and post-structuralism's embrace of fluidity and contingency. Returning to the 1968 protests, we see how these intellectual currents converged in practice. During a heated assembly at the University of Nanterre, a student shouted, "The university is a prison." Foucault, standing at the back, smiled and whispered to a colleague, "Exactly." The disciplinary mechanisms we study are not confined to the penal system. They are present in every institution that seeks to produce docile bodies. The protesters, armed with slogans and banners, were, perhaps unwittingly, enacting the very dynamics they were critiquing. The university, with its examinations, lecture halls, and hierarchical faculty, functioned as a panoptic apparatus. The students' demand for freedom of thought was simultaneously a call to dismantle the mechanisms that made such thought possible in the first place. In the years that followed, Foucault would continue to refine his ideas, moving from the analysis of madness and the clinic to the study of sexuality, punishment, and governmentality. Yet the seeds of those later projects are unmistakably present in his early work. The genealogical method, the focus on power as productive, the skepticism toward universal subjects, all of these trace back to the intellectual climate of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, to the Nietzschean critique of morality, the Heideggerian emphasis on historicity, and the Durkheimian insistence on social facts. Moreover, his personal encounters, first with Sartre's existentialism, then with Althusser's structural Marxism, served as both catalysts and foils, sharpening his own theoretical stance. To appreciate the depth of these influences, it helps to hear directly from the thinkers themselves. Nietzsche, in On the Genealogy of Morals, asks, "What is the origin of the noble and the base? What is the origin of the feeling of guilt?" This question, simple yet profound, underlies Foucault's interrogation of the origins of modern institutions. Heidegger in Being and Time reminds us that the human being is not the master of being, but rather the being that is most affected by it. Durkheim in his classic Suicide declares, social facts are capable of exerting a coercive power over the individual. Each of these statements, when placed side by side, forms a triangulation that points toward a view of humanity as always already embedded in a web of forces that shape, constrain, and enable. Foucault himself, reflecting on his early years, once said in an interview, "I was never content with the explanations offered by either existentialism or Marxism. I wanted a history that could tell me not only what is, but how it came to be and what possibilities remain open." This succinctly captures the spirit of his project. A relentless quest to uncover the conditions of possibility, to map the hidden mechanisms that produce what we take for granted, and to keep open the space for new forms of thought and resistance. In sum, the historical and intellectual roots of Michel Foucault's philosophy are a tapestry woven from the threads of Nietzsche's genealogy, Heidegger's historicity, Durkheim's social facts, Sartre's existential freedom, and Althusser's structural Marxism. The climate of post-war France, with its vibrant debates, student movements, and institutional reforms, provided the fertile ground where these ideas could interact, clash, and recombine. Foucault's early work, most notably his 1961 thesis on madness, demonstrates how he synthesized these influences into a distinctive method that interrogates the relationship between power and knowledge. The anecdotes of his thesis defense and his participation in the 1968 protests illustrate not only his scholarly rigor, but also his lived commitment to questioning the very structures he studied. By confronting the dominant paradigms of his time, existentialism and structural Marxism, Foucault carved out a unique intellectual path that would later give rise to post-structuralism, a movement that continues to reshape how we think about subjectivity, authority, and the possibilities of resistance. The story of these origins is not a mere historical footnote. It is the foundation upon which Foucault built a philosophy that remains as provocative and relevant today as it was in the turbulent decades of the 1960s. When we begin to trace the contours of Michel Foucault's archaeological method, it helps to imagine ourselves as careful excavators, not of ancient pottery or fossils, but of the very layers of thought that have shaped the way we speak, write, and understand the world. In the calm of a quiet study, we can picture the scholar's hand gently brushing away the sediment of centuries, revealing the hidden structures that organize knowledge. Foucault invites us to set aside the familiar narrative of progress, to suspend the notion that ideas simply evolve in a straight line, and instead to attend to the ruptures, the silences, the moments when a whole system of statements collapses and gives birth to a new configuration. This is the essence of what he calls an archaeology of knowledge, a method that seeks to map the rules that govern the emergence, the transformation, and the disappearance of discursive formations. The term discursive formation occupies a central place in Foucault's vocabulary. It refers not merely to a collection of ideas or a school of thought, but to a network of statements that are bound together by a set of conditions of existence. These conditions are not external to the statements. They are internal rules that determine what can be said, how it can be said, and what counts as a legitimate object of discourse. In other words, a discursive formation is a kind of grammar of knowledge, a set of syntactic and semantic constraints that make certain propositions possible while rendering others invisible. When we speak of the grammar of the modern university, for instance, we are invoking a discursive formation that structures the way research is presented, the way citations are used, and the way expertise is validated. Closely linked to the notion of discursive formation is the concept of statement, which in Foucault's archaeology is more than a sentence. A statement is an element of discourse that carries both a propositional content and a function within a specific field of knowledge. It is the unit that can be counted, ordered, and compared across time. Each statement is produced under specific conditions of possibility, and each participates in the larger architecture of the discourse. When a scientist writes, "The cell is the basic unit of life," that utterance is not just a factual claim. It is a statement that sits within a field of biology, that draws upon a set of experimental practices, that references a history of microscopic observation, and that is governed by the rules of what counts as a biological fact in a particular epoch. The third pillar of Foucault's archaeology is the episteme. An episteme is the deep, often invisible structure that underlies a whole historical period's discursive formations. It is not a theory or a set of ideas, but a set of conditions that make certain statements possible and others impossible. Think of an episteme as the climate in which knowledge grows, a climate that determines which species of thought can thrive. In the Renaissance, the episteme was shaped by a reverence for the classical authorities, a fascination with the microcosm and macrocosm, and a language that intertwined natural philosophy with metaphysics. By the 19th century, a new episteme had emerged, one that privileged observation, classification, and the mechanistic explanation of living beings. This shift is not simply a matter of adding new facts. It is a transformation of the very ground upon which facts can be said. To illustrate the power of these concepts, let us turn to a concrete example: the classical episteme of the Renaissance versus the modern episteme of biology. In the 16th and early 17th centuries, natural philosophers such as Girolamo Fracastoro, Paracelsus, and even the early astronomers of the Copernican revolution spoke in a language that blended the observable with the symbolic. A disease was not merely a pathogen, it was an imbalance of humors, a manifestation of celestial influence, a moral failing. The statements that circulated, "The fever is a fire of the blood, the plague follows the alignment of the planets," were governed by a discursive formation that linked the human body to the cosmos, that treated natural phenomena as signs to be interpreted. The episteme of the time allowed for a seamless interweaving of the natural and the metaphysical. Fast forward to the late 19th century, and we encounter the modern episteme of biology, a field reshaped by the work of Charles Darwin, Gregor Mendel, and later, the rise of microbiology. Here, disease becomes an organism, a bacterium, a virus, entities that can be isolated, cultured, and studied under the microscope. The statements shift. The tubercle bacillus causes tuberculosis. Mendelian inheritance follows discrete units. The cell is the basic unit of life. These statements belong to a discursive formation that privileges empirical observation, experimental manipulation, and a mechanistic vocabulary. The episteme has altered the very terms of the debate. The old language of humors and celestial influence no longer has a place within the new grammar of biology. The transformation is not simply additive. It is a reconfiguration of the ground that makes certain statements intelligible and renders others unintelligible. A second, equally vivid illustration can be found in the way language about disease changed during the 19th century. In the early part of the century, a physician might describe cholera as a pestilence of the air, attributing its spread to miasmas, poisonous vapors rising from decaying matter. The discursive formation of the time linked health to the quality of the environment, and public health measures focused on cleaning streets, improving ventilation, and controlling odors. By the 1880s, with the work of Robert Koch and Louis Pasteur, the same disease began to be spoken of in terms of a specific bacterium, Vibrio cholerae. The statement "cholera is caused by a microscopic organism that thrives in contaminated water" reorients the entire field of public health. Now, the focus shifts to water treatment, sewage systems, and laboratory diagnostics. The episteme has moved from a miasmatic to a germ-theoretic framework, and the language of disease is recast accordingly. The shift is not merely a matter of new facts. It is a transformation of the underlying rules that determine what can be said about illness, what counts as evidence, and how society responds. It is worth pausing here and asking ourselves, how do we become aware of these deep structures? Foucault did not discover them in a laboratory. He uncovered them through a careful reading of texts, a methodical counting of statements, and an analysis of the rules that allowed those statements to emerge. The story of how he first articulated this method is itself a fascinating anecdote. In the autumn of 1970, Foucault was invited to deliver a series of lectures at the Collège de France, a venerable institution that had, for centuries, been the stage for the most daring intellectual performances in France. Over the course of several weeks, he stood before a room of eager graduate students, seasoned scholars, and a handful of skeptical philosophers, and he laid out the foundations of what he would later publish as the archaeology of knowledge. He spoke of the order of statements, of the regularities that govern the emergence of discourses, and of the necessity of a method that does not start from the content of ideas, but from the conditions of their possibility. The lectures were not merely academic. They were a performance, a ritual of excavation, in which Foucault invited his listeners to become co-archaeologists, to sift through the sediment of history, and to uncover the hidden grammar of thought. The reaction to these lectures was immediate and polarized. Within the French academic circles that had long dominated the study of philosophy, a sharp debate erupted. Some praised Foucault for his daring break from traditional hermeneutics, for his refusal to reduce history to a series of great men and their ideas. Others, however, saw in his critique of the human sciences an affront to the very foundations of their disciplines. A particularly vivid episode occurred when the director of the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, a staunch defender of structuralism, publicly challenged Foucault, accusing him of relativizing truth and turning knowledge into a mere game of power. The dispute was not merely personal. It reflected a deeper tension between those who believed that the human sciences could claim a neutral, objective stance, and those who, following Foucault, saw those sciences as embedded in specific historical regimes of power and knowledge. The controversy illuminated the stakes of the archaeological method. If knowledge is always already structured by an episteme, then the claim to a neutral, universal science becomes suspect. This brings us to the most compelling counterarguments to Foucault's archaeology. Jacques Derrida, the father of deconstruction, offered a critique that is both sympathetic and sharply divergent. In his essay The Archive and the Method, Derrida engages directly with Foucault's notion of the archive as a neutral repository of statements. Derrida argues that the archive is never a simple storage. It is always already marked by the act of selection, by the power to include and exclude. He writes, the archive is not a neutral background, but a site of violence, a place where the decision of what may be said and what must remain unsaid is inscribed. For Derrida, the very attempt to conduct a neutral archaeology is undermined by the fact that the researcher must decide which statements to count, which periods to compare, and which rules to highlight. This deconstructive reading suggests that any archaeology is already a form of interpretation, that the neutral method is an ideal that cannot be fully realized. Derrida's challenge forces us to consider the limits of Foucault's claim that we can step outside the discourse and observe its rules objectively. A second, more sociologically oriented counterpoint comes from Eugen Habermas, whose theory of communicative action emphasizes the possibility of rational discourse free from domination. Habermas contends that despite the historical contingencies that shape discourse, there remains a public sphere where participants can engage in unforced, rational communication aimed at reaching mutual understanding. In his critique of Foucault, Habermas argues that the archaeological focus on power relations and episteme risks, neglecting the emancipatory potential of discourse. He asks if all knowledge is merely a product of power structures, where does the possibility of critique of transformation reside? For Habermas, the notion of a neutral, or at least partially neutral, arena for rational argument remains viable, and the task of philosophy is to uncover the conditions under which such an arena can flourish. His communicative action theory thus serves as a foil to Foucault's more skeptical stance, highlighting a fundamental debate within contemporary philosophy. Can we ever achieve a truly neutral archaeology, or is every analysis inevitably entangled with normative concerns? These debates are not merely academic squabbles, they echo throughout the subsequent development of Foucault's own thought. After the archaeological phase, Foucault turned to what he called genealogy, a method that builds upon archaeology but adds a more explicit focus on power, subjectivity, and the historical formation of the self. Genealogy, as we see in Discipline and Punish and the History of Sexuality, retains the archaeological attention to discursive formations, yet it also incorporates a critique of the ways in which power operates through institutions, practices, and the very formation of subjects. The continuity is evident. Both archaeology and genealogy seek to uncover the rules that make statements possible. The rupture lies in genealogy's willingness to foreground the ethical and political stakes of those rules, to ask not only what can be said, but also who is allowed to speak, and to whose benefit. In this sense, the debates with Derrida and Habermas foreshadow the later tensions in Foucault's work between the descriptive excavation of knowledge and the normative implications of power. Returning to the concrete examples, we can see how the shift from the classical episteme to the modern episteme of biology illustrates both the archaeological and genealogical dimensions. The archaeological lens reveals the change in the grammar of statements about life. From the soul animates the body to the cell is the basic unit of life. The genealogical lens asks who benefits from this new grammar. The rise of the modern laboratory, the professionalization of scientists, the emergence of a new class of experts who claim authority over the body. These are power relations that become visible when we trace the genealogy of biology. Similarly, the transformation in the language of disease from miasma to germ theory not only reorganizes the discursive formation, but also reshapes social practices. Quarantine becomes a medical procedure, sanitation becomes a state responsibility, and the sick individual becomes a carrier of a pathogen rather than a morally compromised soul. The genealogical perspective invites us to ask how these changes affect the distribution of responsibility and the governance of populations. To deepen our appreciation of these shifts, consider an anecdote from the laboratory of Robert Koch in the 1880s. When Koch first identified the anthrax bacillus, he famously placed a mouse on a glass plate, inoculated it with the bacteria, and watched the animal die within hours. He then announced to his colleagues, "I have found the cause of the disease. It is a living organism." The statement was not merely a scientific claim, it was a performative act that redefined the very notion of disease. In the same way that an archaeologist uncovers a buried artifact, Koch's experiment revealed a hidden layer of the biological episteme. Yet, as we later learned, the germ theory itself would be challenged by the rise of immunology, virology, and ecological approaches to disease, each bringing new discursive formations and new episteme. The archaeology of knowledge reminds us that what appears to be a final, settled truth is often just a temporary configuration within a larger field of possibilities. Another vivid historical vignette concerns the French academic response to Foucault's critique of the human sciences in the early 1970s. After the Collège de France lectures, a group of philosophers and sociologists convened a symposium at the École Normale Supérieure to discuss the implications of Foucault's archaeology. Among the participants was the structuralist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who argued that the deep structures of myth and language could still be uncovered through systematic analysis, a stance that seemed to run parallel to Foucault's search for underlying rules. Yet Lévi-Strauss also expressed discomfort with Foucault's emphasis on power, warning that to reduce all knowledge to power relations is to ignore the autonomous dynamics of symbolic systems. The debate at that symposium encapsulated the broader intellectual climate of the time. A moment when scholars were grappling with the possibility of a neutral method versus the inevitability of political entanglement. The very fact that these discussions took place within the hallowed halls of French academia underscores the stakes of Foucault's archaeological project. When we listen to the rhythm of Foucault's own words, we sense the careful balance he strives to achieve between description and critique. In the archaeology of knowledge, he writes, "We must not be tempted to think that the analysis of the conditions of possibility of statements is a simple, mechanical exercise. It is a practice that demands a rigorous, almost scientific, attention to the regularities that govern discourse." This sentence encapsulates the methodological rigor of archaeology, a commitment to counting, to mapping, to uncovering the rules that operate beneath the surface. Yet later in Discipline and Punish, he declares, "Power is not something that is acquired, seized, or shared, something that one can hold on to." The shift from the careful counting of statements to the broader analysis of power illustrates the continuity and rupture between archaeology and genealogy. It also shows why the debates with Derrida and Habermas remain relevant. They each challenge us to consider whether any method can ever be truly detached from the power it seeks to describe. To bring these abstract ideas back to everyday experience, let us consider a modern analogy. Imagine you are walking through a city at night and you notice that every streetlight is a different shade of amber. You might assume this is a random aesthetic choice, but upon closer inspection, you discover that the City Council adopted a lighting ordinance in the 1990s that required amber light to reduce light pollution and protect nocturnal wildlife. The ordinance is the rule that makes the amber lights possible. The streetlights themselves are the statements that manifest the rule, and the broader concern for environmental preservation, scientific research on wildlife, and urban planning constitutes the episteme that made such an ordinance conceivable. If you were to conduct an archaeological analysis of the city's lighting, you would catalog the statements, the individual streetlights, identify the formation, the municipal lighting policy, and trace the episteme, the environmental concerns of the late 20th century. This simple urban example mirrors the more complex historical cases Foucault examined, showing how the same methodological steps can be applied to any field of knowledge. Returning to the historical examples, the shift in the language of disease during the 19th century also offers a powerful illustration of how discursive formations can be counted and compared. If we were to tally the frequency of the term miasma in medical journals from 1800 to 1850, we would see a gradual decline, while the appearance of bacterium or germ would rise sharply after 1880. This quantitative pattern, which Foucault would describe as a regularity of emergence, signals a change in the underlying grammar. The statements that once invoked atmospheric vapors are replaced by statements that invoke microscopic organisms. The episteme has moved from a cosmological to a biological orientation. This shift is not merely linguistic, it reorganizes the entire practice of medicine, from diagnosis to treatment, from public health policy to the very identity of the physician. In examining the counterarguments, it is useful to reflect on Derrida's notion of the trace, which he describes as the mark of the absent within the present. For Derrida, every statement carries within it the memory of what it excludes, the other that is not said. When Foucault attempts to isolate a discursive formation, he must inevitably confront the trace of the statements that have been silenced or suppressed. Derrida would ask, can we ever truly map a formation without acknowledging the ghosts that haunt it? This challenge pushes us to consider that any archaeological map is provisional, always leaving out something, always haunted by the absent. The implication is that the archaeology of knowledge is an ongoing process, a perpetual excavation that never reaches a final, complete picture. Habermas, on the other hand, would point to the possibility of ideal speech situations, moments in which participants can engage in dialogue free from coercion, thereby achieving a form of rational consensus. He would argue that even within a given episteme, there can be spaces for critique and transformation. For instance, the emergence of feminist critiques of medical discourse in the 1970s created a new discursive formation that questioned the patriarchal assumptions embedded in the language of disease. The statements "women are more prone to hysteria" began to be challenged, and new statements about gendered health disparities entered the discourse. This demonstrates that while epistemes set the conditions for what can be said, they are not immutable. They can be contested and reshaped through communicative action. In this view, the archaeology of knowledge becomes a tool for identifying the constraints that must be overcome in order to open new spaces for dialogue. The interplay between archaeology and genealogy also surfaces in Foucault's later work on the care of the self. In the History of Sexuality, he explores how the modern episteme of sexuality, characterized by discourses of confession, medicalization, and psychoanalysis, produces subjects who are simultaneously objects and agents of knowledge. Here, the archaeological method helps us see how statements about sexuality have been organized over centuries, while the genealogical lens reveals how power operates through those statements to shape the self. The continuity is clear, the same attentiveness to the rules of discourse persists. The rupture appears in the explicit focus on the ethical dimensions of self-formation. This evolution mirrors the earlier debates with Derrida and Habermas, as Foucault moves from a descriptive archaeology to a more activist genealogy, acknowledging that the act of uncovering knowledge is itself a political gesture. To bring the discussion full circle, let us reflect on a quote that encapsulates the spirit of Foucault's archaeology. The true aim of archaeology is not to discover a hidden truth, but to show how truth itself is constructed. This statement reminds us that the purpose of the method is not to find an ultimate foundation, but to expose the processes by which statements become truth. In doing so, we become aware of the limits of our own thinking, the hidden scaffolding that supports what we take for granted. When we apply this insight to contemporary debates, whether about climate change, artificial intelligence, or social justice, we can ask, what are the current discursive formations that shape our understanding? What episteme underlies our talk of data, algorithm, or sustainability? By conducting a modern archaeology, we can begin to see the rules that make certain claims possible and others invisible. The significance of the 1970 Collège de France lectures, therefore, extends beyond their historical context. They represent a moment when a philosopher dared to ask, what if we could step back from the content of ideas and look instead at the conditions that allow those ideas to appear? The reaction of the French academic establishment, both the enthusiasm of those who saw a new path forward and the hostility of those who feared the erosion of disciplinary authority, reveals how deeply the question of neutrality is felt. The subsequent debates with Derrida and Habermas illustrate that the question remains unsettled. Can any method be truly neutral, or is every analysis already a form of power? Foucault's own trajectory suggests that he came to accept the latter view, moving from archaeology's careful counting to genealogy's explicit engagement with power. In our contemporary moment, the archaeology of knowledge offers a powerful lens for examining the digital age. Consider the way social media platforms have reconfigured the grammar of public discourse. Statements are now limited to 280 characters, to hashtags, to algorithmically curated feeds. The discursive formation of online communication is governed by the architecture of platforms, the business models of data monetization, and the technical constraints of bandwidth. The episteme that makes these statements possible includes a belief in the democratizing power of technology, a faith in real-time interaction, and an assumption that data can be quantified and analyzed. By applying an archaeological method, we could map the emergence of terms like viral, influencer, and filter bubble, trace their regularities, and uncover the rules that make them intelligible. A genealogical turn would then ask how these rules shape power relations. who controls the flow of information, whose voices are amplified, whose are silenced. The same methodological steps that Foucault used to study the shift from miasma to germ theory can be repurposed to study the shift from print to digital media. Finally, let us return to the notion of the statement as a unit of analysis. In everyday life, we often overlook how each utterance we make participates in a larger formation. When a teacher says the earth revolves around the sun, that statement is not simply a fact. It is part of a discursive formation that includes astronomy, physics, education curricula, and a modern episteme that privileges empirical observation over geocentric myth. The teacher's statement draws on a history of scientific revolutions, of telescopic discoveries, of the printing press, and of the institutional authority of schools. By recognizing the statement as a node within a network, we become more attuned to the conditions that make it possible and the power structures it sustains. In sum, the archaeology of knowledge, as articulated by Michel Foucault, invites us to become attentive to the hidden rules that govern the emergence of statements, to map the discursive formations that bind them, and to uncover the episteme that makes them intelligible. Through concrete examples, the transition from the classical Renaissance episteme to the modern biological episteme, and the linguistic shift in disease from miasma to germ theory, we see how these abstract concepts play out in real historical change. The anecdotes of the 1970 Collège de France lectures and the fierce reaction of French academic circles illustrate the lived stakes of this methodological innovation. The counterarguments from Derrida and Habermas sharpen the debate, reminding us that the quest for a neutral archaeology is contested, that the archive is always already a site of power, and that communicative action may still carve out spaces for critique. The later development of genealogy shows both continuity and rupture, extending the archaeological focus on rules into a deeper analysis of power and subjectivity. By weaving together these strands, definitions, examples, anecdotes, debates, and cross-references, we arrive at a richer, more nuanced understanding of how knowledge is not a static edifice but a dynamic field of statements, each bound by the invisible grammar of its time. As we close this segment, let us carry forward the calm curiosity of the archaeological scholar, ever ready to brush away the dust of history and glimpse the structures that shape our present, and perhaps, in doing so, to imagine new possibilities for the future. The story of Michel Foucault's thought on power and knowledge begins, not with a grand proclamation, but with a simple, almost whispered observation. Power is everywhere. Not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere. In the quiet of his lectures, in the dust-laden archives of French prisons, and in the meticulous footnotes of his books, Foucault invites us to listen closely to the ways in which what we call knowledge is never a neutral mirror of reality, but always a map drawn by hands that also hold the reins of power. Imagine for a moment standing on a hill overlooking a vast field of wheat. From that height you can see the rows, the patterns, the way the wind shapes each stalk. From the ground, however, you are caught in the rustle of the stalks, the heat of the sun, the weight of the soil. Foucault asks us to shift constantly between those two perspectives, between the aerial view that reveals structures and the lived experience that reveals their effects. It is this oscillation that underpins his core thesis, that power and knowledge are not two separate entities that occasionally intersect, but rather two sides of the same coin, co-producing each other in every historical moment. When he first articulated this idea in the 1970 lecture series Power/Knowledge, he began with a striking image. The exercise of power is not a single act, but a whole series of techniques and strategies that are embedded in the very fabric of social institutions. He did not merely define power as a force that can be seized or lost. He described it as a network of relations that circulates through the smallest details of daily life. Knowledge, in this view, is not a collection of facts waiting to be discovered, but a set of practices that shape what we are able to see, name, and ultimately to govern. One of the most vivid illustrations of this intertwining is the concept of disciplinary power, which Foucault develops in his seminal work Discipline and Punish. He asks us to picture the 18th century French prison, the Bastille, with its towering walls and its chaotic public executions. Then he leads us forward across the centuries to the sleek, regimented institutions of the modern age, schools, hospitals, factories, and the prison of Clairvaux, where he spent months observing the daily rhythms of confinement. In these spaces, power is no longer exercised through spectacular spectacles of violence, but through subtle, continuous mechanisms that shape bodies and minds. The metaphor that best captures this shift is the panopticon, Jeremy Bentham's architectural design for a prison that never needed guards to watch every inmate. In the panopticon, a central tower overlooks a circular array of cells, each equipped with a window that faces the tower but not the outside world. The inmates cannot see whether they are being observed at any given moment, and this uncertainty compels them to regulate their own behavior. As Foucault writes, the panopticon must be understood as a model of functioning power, a power that works through the very possibility of being seen. He does not present the panopticon as a literal blueprint for all modern institutions, but as an analytical lens. The principle of constant, invisible surveillance has migrated far beyond prisons. In schools, teachers monitor attendance, grades, and conduct. In workplaces, managers track productivity through time cards and performance metrics. In digital platforms, algorithms record clicks, likes, and location data. Each of these practices creates a disciplinary society where individuals internalize the gaze and adjust themselves accordingly, often without ever knowing who or what is watching. It was during a lecture in 1975 at the University of Paris VII, a lecture that would later be known simply as the Panopticon Lecture, that Foucault made this migration explicit. He stood before a room of eager graduate students, the walls lined with chalkboards scribbled in French, and he traced the genealogy of the Panopticon from Bentham's prison design to the modern classroom. He paused, letting the silence settle, then said, "We must ask ourselves, who is the watcher and who is the watched, when the watcher is a set of statistical norms, and the watched are the bodies that conform to those norms." The lecture resonated beyond academia. It sparked debates in sociology, law, and even urban planning, where city designers began to think about surveillance spaces in public squares and transit hubs. The second pillar of Foucault's analysis of power/knowledge is the medicalization of sexuality, explored in the first volume of the History of Sexuality. Here, he turns his gaze to the 19th century emergence of sexology, a discipline that claimed to scientifically map human desire. He shows how the discourse of sexuality was not an uncovered truth, but a construct that allowed institutions, psychiatrists, doctors, the state to regulate bodies and populations. The famous passage, "The Repressive Hypothesis," that power represses sexuality, is itself a form of power that makes sexuality speak, reveals a paradox. By naming and categorizing sexual practices, power makes them visible, manageable, and ultimately controllable. Consider the case of the French psychiatrist Pierre Janet, whose work on hysteria in the late 1800s laid the groundwork for what would become a clinical vocabulary of deviant sexuality. Janet's case notes, now part of the archives at the Musée de la Médecine, describe women who exhibited symptoms of uncontrollable desire, a language that framed personal longing as a pathological condition. By translating desire into a medical problem, the state could intervene through therapy, institutionalization, or legal restriction, thereby extending its reach into the most intimate spheres of life. Foucault's fieldwork at the prison of Clairvaux provides a concrete illustration of how disciplinary techniques operate in practice. He arrived in 1972, armed with a notebook, a recorder, and a curiosity about the daily routines that govern the lives of inmates. He observed the regimented schedule: wake up at 6, roll call at 7, work assignments at 8, meals at noon, and lights out at 10. Each moment was punctuated by an inspection, a roll call, a report. The prison's architecture, long corridors, barred windows, watchtowers, reinforced a sense of constant observation. Yet what struck Foucault most was not the overt presence of guards, but the way the inmates themselves internalized the schedule, adjusting their breathing, their posture, their speech to match the expectations of the institution. He wrote in his field notes, "The power that shapes the body is not the force that strikes it, but the rhythm that teaches it to move in time with the institution." From these observations, Foucault extrapolates a broader claim: that modern societies have replaced the sovereign's spectacular displays of power, executions, wars, decrees, with a diffuse, micro-politics that operates through norms, measurements, and classifications. This is the essence of what he later calls governmentality, a term he coined in a series of lectures at the Collège de France in the late 1970s. Governmentality, he explains, is the art of governing beyond the state, the way in which the conduct of individuals or groups is directed. It is a form of power that works not through coercion, but through the shaping of desire, the cultivation of self-governance. The concept of governmentality opens a pathway to contemporary debates, especially in public health. Take, for instance, the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Governments worldwide employed a suite of disciplinary techniques: contact tracing apps, mandatory mask policies, vaccination passports. Each of these measures relies on the collection of data: who has been tested, who has been vaccinated, who has traveled. The data become knowledge, and the knowledge becomes the basis for further regulation. The pandemic thus becomes a living laboratory for Foucault's thesis. Power produces knowledge, infection rates are numbers, and that knowledge, in turn, justifies new forms of power, lockdowns, travel bans. The discourse of public health functions as a modern panopticon, where citizens are constantly measured against epidemiological standards, and where non-compliance is framed not merely as a personal choice, but as a threat to collective safety. But Foucault's analysis has not gone unchallenged. Feminist scholars, notably Nancy Fraser, have argued that his treatment of power is gender-blind, that it overlooks how power relations are mediated through gendered hierarchies. Fraser writes Foucault's genealogical method, while powerful in exposing the mechanisms of discipline, tends to abstract away from the lived experiences of women, whose bodies have historically been sites of both knowledge production and oppression. She points to the way sexual norms, once medicalized, have been used to police women's bodies through practices such as forced sterilization, the criminalization of abortion, and the pathologization of female desire. Fraser contends that a truly comprehensive account of power must integrate a critique of how gender shapes the production of knowledge, and how gendered power structures can reinforce or subvert disciplinary mechanisms. From a Marxist perspective, Louis Althusser offers a different critique. Althusser emphasizes the primacy of the economic base, the mode of production, in shaping the superstructure of ideology, law, and institutions. He argues that Foucault's focus on micropolitics and discourse risks obscuring the material conditions that undergird the very apparatuses of power. In Althusser's view, the prison system, the medical profession, and the education system are not merely sites of discourse, but also reproductions of the capitalist mode of production, designed to produce disciplined, compliant labor. He famously wrote, "Ideology is a representation of the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence." For Althusser, the analysis must begin with the economic relations that determine who owns the means of production, and only then can we understand how disciplinary techniques serve to maintain class domination. These counterarguments do not invalidate Foucault's insights, rather they enrich them, highlighting the need for a multi-layered analysis that can accommodate both the discursive and the material. In dialogue with Fraser, we might ask, how does the medicalization of sexuality intersect with patriarchal structures that assign women a passive role in sexual relations? In conversation with Althusser, we can explore how the discipline of the factory floor mirrors the regimented schedules of Clairvaux, both serving the needs of a capitalist economy that requires predictable, timed labor. The synthesis of these perspectives leads us to a more nuanced understanding of power as both a set of techniques and a reflection of deeper structural forces. The influence of Foucault's ideas extends far beyond his own era, resonating in the work of later theorists such as Giorgio Agamben. In his book State of Exception, Agamben takes the panopticon's principle of perpetual visibility and pushes it further, arguing that modern states increasingly operate in a permanent state of exception, where the law is suspended in the name of emergency, and where the distinction between law and violence blurs. He writes, "The sovereign is he who decides on the exception. The exception is the space where the law is both suspended and affirmed." This notion dovetails with Foucault's claim that power produces knowledge, because the exception creates a new body of knowledge, security protocols, emergency powers, risk assessments, that then justifies further extensions of power. Another contemporary line of thought that draws on Foucault's governmentality is the field of biopolitics, which examines how states manage populations through the regulation of life itself, birth, health, mortality. In the wake of the pandemic, scholars have examined how vaccination campaigns constitute a form of biopolitics. The state collects biometric data, classifies individuals as immune or vulnerable, and allocates resources accordingly. This mirrors Foucault's analysis of the 19th century management of public health through the medical gaze, where physicians, by categorizing patients, also exercised a subtle form of governance over bodies. The term biopolitics has become a staple in discussions about reproductive rights, genetic engineering, and even climate policy, where the state's role in shaping the very conditions of life is foregrounded. To bring these abstract ideas into everyday experience, let us consider two concrete examples. The first is the modern workplace's use of open-plan offices. At first glance, these spaces promise collaboration, transparency, and a flattening of hierarchy. Yet they also embody a disciplinary logic. The removal of private walls makes employees visible to one another, creating a subtle pressure to conform to norms of productivity and behavior. The architecture itself becomes a panoptic device, where the gaze is not centralized in a tower, but diffused among peers. Employees often report feeling always on, a sensation that echoes the internalized surveillance of the panopticon. The second example lies in the realm of digital dating platforms. Apps such as Tinder or Bumble reduce attraction to a series of data points, age, height, interests presented as a swipeable grid. The algorithmic matching process creates a knowledge base about desire, which then shapes users' expectations and behaviors. As Foucault would note, the platform's knowledge of what is desirable exerts power over how individuals present themselves, what they deem acceptable, and how they negotiate intimacy. The platform's terms of service, privacy policies, and data collection practices are modern equivalents of the medical gaze, turning personal desire into quantifiable, manageable data. These analogies help us see that Foucault's concepts are not confined to prisons or lecture halls, they permeate the very fabric of contemporary life. The panopticon's invisible watchtower can be a corporate dashboard, a health app, or a social media feed. The medicalization of sexuality can be a diagnostic label in a therapist's notebook or a risk factor in a public health campaign. The disciplinary techniques that once regulated the movement of inmates now schedule our emails, our notifications, our moments of rest. Returning to the historical anecdotes, the 1975 Panopticon lecture at Paris VIII stands as a turning point in the reception of Foucault's ideas. In that lecture, he did not merely describe the architecture of surveillance. He invited the audience to imagine a society where the watcher is a set of statistical norms, and the watched are the bodies that internalize those norms. He paused, let the words settle, and asked, if the prison is a school and the school a prison, where does the line between discipline and education truly lie? The question reverberated through French intellectual circles, prompting a wave of research into how schools function as sites of disciplinary power, a line of inquiry that continues to inform educational policy debates today. His fieldwork at Clairvaux, meanwhile, provides a vivid tactile illustration of how power is embodied. He described the way the morning light filtered through the narrow windows, casting long shadows across the stone floor, how the clink of metal keys punctuated the silence, and how the inmates' faces, illuminated for a brief moment, seemed to both resist and accept the rhythm imposed upon them. He noted, the body learns the schedule learns the body. This paradox captures the essence of disciplinary power. It is both external and internal, a dance between the institution's demands and the subject's adaptation. In the decades since, scholars have taken these observations and applied them to new contexts. The field of critical prison studies, for instance, builds directly on Foucault's methodology, interrogating how contemporary prisons use technology, cameras, biometric scanners, electronic tagging, to extend the panoptic gaze beyond walls and into the community. Researchers point to the electronic monitoring of parolees as a modern embodiment of the panopticon, where the state can track movements in real time, generating data that feeds back into risk assessments and sentencing decisions. Meanwhile, feminist scholars have expanded on Fraser's critique, arguing that the medicalization of sexuality must be understood in the context of intersectional oppression. Scholars such as Judith Butler have shown how gender performance is regulated through discourses that label certain expressions as normal or deviant. They argue that the same mechanisms that pathologized homosexuality in the early 20th century also pathologized trans identities, reinforcing a binary that serves patriarchal power structures. In this sense, the knowledge produced by sexology is not neutral. It is a tool that can both liberate and constrain, depending on who wields it. From a Marxist angle, contemporary scholars have revisited Althusser's emphasis on the economic base in light of the rise of the gig economy. Platforms like Uber and Deliveroo employ algorithms that monitor drivers' locations, speed, and customer ratings. These data points constitute a knowledge regime that dictates the terms of labor, turning workers into digital subjects whose performance is continuously measured. The disciplinary power here is not imposed by a physical guard, but by a code that decides who gets a ride, who gets a bonus, who gets deactivated. This aligns with Althusser's claim that the superstructure, here the digital platform, serves the interests of the underlying mode of production, which in this case is the extraction of surplus value from precarious labor. Agamben's notion of the state of exception becomes particularly salient when we consider emergency powers invoked during health crises, natural disasters, or terrorism threats. In each case, governments suspend ordinary legal protections, justify extraordinary surveillance, and expand the reach of biopolitical control. The pandemic's lockdowns can be read as a state of exception that normalizes the collection of health data, the enforcement of movement restrictions, and the imposition of health mandates. The knowledge-generated case numbers, contact tracing graphs, becomes the justification for extending power, echoing Foucault's claim that knowledge produces power and power produces knowledge. In contemporary public health debates, the tension between individual liberty and collective safety illustrates the ongoing relevance of Foucault's analysis. Take the controversy over vaccine passports. Proponents argue that the passports are a rational tool, a piece of knowledge that identifies low-risk individuals and allows society to reopen safely. Critics counter that they constitute a new form of disciplinary power, creating a class of vaccinated citizens who enjoy full rights while the unvaccinated are excluded from public spaces, travel, or employment. The debate is not merely about the efficacy of vaccines, but about how the knowledge of vaccination status becomes a mechanism of governance, shaping social hierarchies and access. To bring this full circle, let us consider an analogy that ties together the panopticon, the medical gaze, and contemporary digital surveillance. Picture a garden. In a traditional garden, a gardener walks among the plants, pruning, watering, and inspecting each leaf. The gardener's presence is visible. The plants respond to the gardener's touch. In a modern, automated garden, sensors embedded in the soil measure moisture, temperature, and nutrient levels. A central computer processes this data and adjusts irrigation, lighting, and fertilizer without any human ever stepping foot in the garden. The plants are still being tended, but the gardener is now an invisible algorithm, and the knowledge of the garden's condition is produced by machines. The power to shape growth now resides not in a visible hand, but in the data streams and the code that interprets them. This is the essence of what Foucault means when he says that power and knowledge are inseparable. The knowledge generated by the sensors is the very instrument through which the garden is governed. When we apply this garden analogy to society, we see that the sensors are our institutions, schools, hospitals, prisons, corporations, collecting data about our behavior, health, and productivity. The central computer is the network of policies, algorithms, and discourses that turn that data into norms. The gardener is no longer a singular sovereign, but a diffuse assemblage of actors, politicians, technologists, medical professionals, who wield power through the knowledge they produce. This perspective helps us understand why resistance to disciplinary power often takes the form of reclaiming privacy, demanding transparency, or challenging the categories that define us. In reflecting on Foucault's legacy, it is useful to recall his own words from the History of Sexuality: where there is power, there is resistance. The very mechanisms that discipline also generate spaces for contestation. The prison protests of the 1970s, the feminist movements that reclaimed sexual agency, the labor strikes against algorithmic management, all are embodiments of resistance that arise precisely because power is never total. They remind us that the relationship between power and knowledge is dynamic, that each act of governance creates the conditions for its own critique. Consider the 1975 lecture again, where Foucault asked, if the prison is a school and the school a prison, where does the line truly lie? The answer, perhaps, is that the line is constantly shifting, drawn and redrawn by those who hold the gaze. In the digital age, the line is drawn in code, in policy, in the very architecture of our devices. Yet, the line can be redrawn by those who learn to see the mechanisms at work, who question the categories imposed upon them, and who demand new forms of knowledge that do not simply serve existing power structures. As we close this segment, let us pause and listen to the echo of Foucault's own voice, a voice that still reverberates through the corridors of academia, the halls of government, and the screens of our smartphones. Power is not something that is seized, it is something that is exercised. In the calm of this reflection, we can sense the weight of that statement, not as a final verdict, but as an invitation to keep looking, to keep asking, to keep tracing the threads that bind knowledge to power, discipline to freedom, and the individual to the collective. The journey through the panopticon, through the medicalization of sexuality, through the fieldwork at Clairvaux, and through the critiques of Fraser, Althusser, and Agamben is not a closed chapter. It is an ongoing conversation, one that asks each of us to become both observer and observed, to recognize the ways in which we are shaped by the knowledge that surrounds us, and to imagine new possibilities for how that knowledge might be reshaped in turn. When we turn our attention to the final phase of Michel Foucault's intellectual journey, we find a thinker who has moved from the archaeology of knowledge and the genealogy of power to a terrain that is at once more intimate and more radical. The ethics of the self. It is in this later period, roughly the early 1980s, that Faucility, if we may coin a term, begins to ask not only how societies shape us, but how we might, in turn, shape ourselves. The shift is subtle yet profound. Whereas his earlier work interrogated the institutions that produce subjects, prisons, asylums, clinics, his later lectures ask what practices we can adopt to become, in his words, The authors of our own lives. The phrase technologies of the self becomes the central metaphor, a toolbox of techniques through which individuals can effectuate a transformation of themselves, not through external coercion, but through an internal work of care. To grasp what Foucault means by a technology of the self, it helps to return to an ancient source that he himself invoked, the Stoic practice of self-examination or examen. The Stoics, from Seneca to Marcus Aurelius, prescribed a daily ritual of reflecting on one's actions, measuring them against the ideal of reason, and correcting the soul's course. In a letter to his friend Lucilius, Seneca writes, "Examine yourself each day, and you will become a better man." Foucault, in his 1982 lecture series, The Hermeneutics of the Subject, picks up this ancient habit and reframes it as a modern technology of the self. He asks, what is the relationship between the care of the self and the care of the soul? He does not simply echo the Stoics. He places them alongside contemporary therapeutic discourses, cognitive behavioral therapy, psychoanalysis, even the secular mindfulness movement that has proliferated across the West. In each case, there is a set of practices, journaling, meditation, dialogue with a therapist, that function as instruments for self-formation. Imagine, for a moment, a gardener tending a plot of land. The soil is the body, the seeds are the dispositions we inherit, and the gardener's tools, spade, hoe, watering can, are the technologies of the self. The gardener does not merely wait for the rain to decide what grows. He decides when to prune, when to fertilize, when to pull weeds. Likewise, Foucault suggests that the subject can become a gardener of the self, using reflective practices to cultivate virtues, to excise habits that no longer serve, and to nurture new ways of being. This gardening metaphor is not merely illustrative, it is a concrete way to understand the ethical work Foucault proposes. The 1982 lecture series at the Collège de France provides a vivid illustration of how Foucault himself embodied this shift. Over the course of the autumn term, he delivered a series of 6 lectures titled The Hermeneutics of the Subject. In the first lecture, he opens with a question that reverberates through the entire series. What is it to be a subject in the present age? He proceeds to trace the genealogy of the subject from the ancient Greek conception of the ethos, the habitus of the soul, to the modern Christian notion of confession, and finally to the secular practices of self-analysis that emerge in the 19th and 20th centuries. In a striking passage, he declares, "The subject is not a thing, but a work to be done." The audience, a mixture of philosophers, historians, and students, responded with a mixture of intrigue and apprehension. One student later recalled that Foucault's voice, normally measured and distant, seemed to soften, as if he were sharing a personal secret rather than delivering a lecture. This anecdote is not merely anecdotal. It exemplifies the way Foucault's own mode of presentation became a technology of the self he was, in that moment, performing the very care of the self he was describing. Another, perhaps less well-known, anecdote comes from Foucault's personal correspondence with emerging gay activist groups in the early 1980s. In a letter dated March 1982, addressed to the French branch of the Gay Liberation Front, he writes, "I have been following your struggle with great interest. Your insistence on naming desire, on refusing to let society impose its own taxonomy upon our bodies, forces me to rethink the way power operates not only on us, but through us." He goes on to ask whether activists have considered the practice of self-care as a political act, suggesting that the daily affirmation of one's identity, through rituals, language, and bodily practices could become a technology of resistance. The activists responded, noting that their outing events, their public declarations of love, were indeed acts of self-formation that challenged the prevailing moral order. This exchange influenced Foucault's later analysis of sexuality, especially his emphasis on the care of the self as a form of political resistance. It shows that his philosophical turn was not abstract speculation, but was rooted in lived, activist contexts. The concept of technologies of the self, however, does not go unchallenged. Gilles Deleuze, a close interlocutor of Foucault, offers a counterpoint that shifts the focus from self-care to desire. In Negotiations, Deleuze writes, "Desire is not a lack to be filled, nor a moral deficit to be corrected. It is the productive force that drives becoming." Deleuze's reading of Foucault's later work emphasizes the affirmative, creative potential of desire as a motor of transformation, rather than the contemplative, almost ascetic practice of self-examination. He argues that the Stoic model, with its emphasis on self-discipline, risks reproducing a form of internalized control that mirrors the very power structures Foucault sought to critique. For Deleuze, the technologies of the self should be reconceived as technologies of desire, wherein individuals harness their affective intensities to produce new assemblages, new ways of being that escape the logic of self-governance. Religious ethicists also raise objections, particularly regarding the secular nature of Foucault's self-crafting. A prominent Catholic theologian, in a 1985 symposium on modern ethics, contended that any ethical project that excludes the divine, that reduces the self to a set of techniques, ultimately empties morality of its transcendent grounding. He points to the Christian tradition of confession, not merely as a technique, but as a sacramental encounter with the divine other, a relational ethic that cannot be reduced to self-care. From this perspective, Foucault's emphasis on the autonomous individual shaping himself through practices is seen as a form of moral relativism, a danger that detaches ethics from any notion of the good that is larger than the self. These criticisms, while serious, also illuminate the richness of Foucault's project. The tension between desire and self-care, between secular technique and religious moral grounding, forces us to ask, can the technologies of the self be both a form of personal empowerment and a site of political struggle? The answer, perhaps, lies in the way contemporary mindfulness movements have appropriated Foucault's ideas. In the West, mindfulness is often presented as a set of secular techniques, breathing exercises, body scans, non-judgmental awareness, that individuals can adopt to reduce stress and increase well-being. Yet scholars such as Christopher J. Miller have noted that this secular mindfulness can be read as a technology of the self that aligns with neoliberal ideals. The subject becomes responsible for managing his own stress, his own productivity, without questioning the structural conditions that generate anxiety. In this light, mindfulness can be seen as a double-edged sword. It offers genuine tools for self-care, but it can also reinforce a regime of self-governance that mirrors the disciplinary mechanisms Foucault once critiqued. To see how this plays out in everyday life, consider two concrete examples. First, the practice of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, invites patients to identify distorted thoughts, challenge them, and replace them with more adaptive cognitions. This is a technology of the self that mirrors the Stoic examen, a systematic, reflective practice aimed at reshaping one's inner landscape. In a CBT session, a therapist might ask, "What evidence do you have for this belief?" The patient, in turn, becomes a kind of self-investigator, scrutinizing the habits of thought that shape emotions and actions. Second, the modern habit of keeping a gratitude journal, writing each evening 3 things one is thankful for, functions similarly. It is a ritual that reorients attention, cultivates a particular affective stance, and over time, reconfigures the subject's relationship to the world. Both practices illustrate how technologies of the self can be embedded in everyday routines, turning ordinary moments into sites of ethical work. The historical antecedents of these practices extend far beyond the Stoics. In medieval Europe, the practice of examen de conscience, a daily review of one's thoughts and deeds before sleep, was a cornerstone of the Jesuit spiritual discipline. Ignatius of Loyola, in his spiritual exercises, prescribed a structured reflection that asks the individual to review the day and to discern where God's presence was felt. While the religious framing differs, the underlying method, a deliberate, systematic self-examination, shares a lineage with the technologies of the self that Foucault later describes. This continuity underscores how techniques of self-formation migrate across epochs, adapting to new philosophical and cultural contexts. Michel Foucault's work on everyday resistance offers yet another cross-reference that enriches our understanding of Foucault's later ethics. In the practice of everyday life, Foucault distinguishes between strategies, employed by institutions to impose order, and tactics, the subtle, creative maneuvers of ordinary people who navigate and subvert those structures. When a commuter takes a different route to avoid the prescribed path of the subway, or when a housewife rearranges the kitchen to suit her own rhythm, she is practicing a form of self-crafting that resists the dominant order. Foucault's tactics can be read as a form of technology of the self, everyday actions that, through repetition and intentionality, shape one's own subjectivity in opposition to imposed structures. Foucault's later focus on the care of the self dovetails with this idea. Both thinkers recognize that power is not only external but also internalized, and that resistance can be enacted through the very practices that constitute everyday life. Returning to the Collège de France lectures, we recall how Foucault, in his 4th lecture, explicitly invokes the Stoic prosach, the attentive presence to one's own thoughts, as a model for contemporary self-formation. He quotes Marcus Aurelius, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." He then asks whether we might develop a modern process that incorporates not only philosophical reflection, but also the insights of psychoanalysis and the therapeutic encounter. He writes, "The art of living is not a matter of finding the right answer, but of learning to ask the right question." This question, he suggests, is at the heart of any technology of the self. It is the invitation to interrogate the habits, discourses, and power relations that shape us. The anecdote of his correspondence with gay activists further illustrates how these questions become politicized. In a 1983 letter to a group of activists in San Francisco, he writes, "When you claim the right to name your desire, you are not merely asserting a sexual identity. You are performing a technology of the self that destabilizes the normative order." He goes on to suggest that the act of publicly declaring one's love, of forming chosen families, is a form of self-crafting that resists the power that would otherwise define and confine you. This insight anticipates later queer theorists, such as Judith Butler, who argue that gender and sexuality are performed through repeated acts. Foucault's emphasis on the performative, self-forming aspect of desire anticipates this line of thought, while also grounding it in a concrete ethical practice, the care of the self as a political act. Yet the counterarguments remain potent. Deleuze, in his collaboration with Félix Guattari, posits that desire itself is a machine that produces reality, and that any attempt to care for the self might inadvertently reinscribe the same machinic processes it seeks to escape. He writes, "Desire is not a thing to be tamed, but a force that propels us beyond the limits of self-governance." For Deleuze, the focus should shift from reflective self-examination to the creation of new assemblages, new ways of relating that break the cycles of self-discipline. This critique pushes us to consider whether Foucault's technologies risk becoming yet another set of techniques that individuals feel compelled to master, rather than liberating forces. Religious ethicists, meanwhile, argue that the secularization of self-care removes the moral anchor that grounds ethical action. A Catholic philosopher in a 1987 essay points out that the Stoic practice of self-examination, when stripped of its theological dimension, becomes a technique of self-domination. He suggests that true ethical transformation requires a relationship to the transcendent, a dialogue with the divine that cannot be reduced to a set of practices. This critique forces us to ask whether the care of the self can be fully secular, or whether it inevitably carries an implicit metaphysical assumption about the nature of the good. In contemporary discourse, the answer seems to be both. Mindfulness programs in corporate settings, for instance, often present themselves as neutral tools for enhancing focus and reducing stress. Yet they also embed a particular vision of the subject. A self-optimizing employee who can manage his own anxiety and increase productivity. Critics argue that this is a form of ethical neoliberalism, where the burden of adaptation is shifted from institutions onto individuals. On the other hand, community-based mindfulness initiatives, such as those organized by refugee support groups, use the same techniques to foster collective resilience, solidarity, and a sense of shared humanity. In these contexts, the technology of the self becomes a technology of the group, a shared practice that nurtures both individual well-being and collective resistance. To bring these threads together, consider an analogy drawn from the world of music. A musician learns scales, studies chord progressions, and practices daily to hone technique. These exercises are not ends in themselves. They are technologies that enable the musician to eventually improvise, to create something new and authentic. Similarly, Foucault's technologies of the self, journaling, meditation, therapeutic dialogue, are not goals but means. They provide the skill set that allows individuals to improvise new ways of being, to respond creatively to the constraints of power. The musician's improvisation, however, is always informed by the cultural repertoire, jazz standards, classical forms that precede it. In the same way, our self-formation is always situated within historical discourses. The Stoic prosach, the Christian confession, the psychoanalytic couch, the digital self-tracking app. Recognizing this lineage helps us avoid the trap of seeing technologies of the self as ahistorical tools. They are instead woven into the fabric of cultural practice. Historical anecdotes further illustrate how practices of self-formation have been mobilized as resistance. In the French Revolution, the Jacobins encouraged citizens to keep carnets de morale, daily notebooks in which they recorded their thoughts and virtues, as a way to cultivate republican citizenship. The practice was intended to forge a new kind of subject, one who internalized the ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity. Fast forward to the 1960s, when the French student movement of May '68 embraced the concept of auto-analyze, encouraging participants to write personal manifestos that expose the hidden structures of desire and authority within themselves. Both moments reveal how the act of self-examination can be weaponized to challenge prevailing power structures, aligning closely with Foucault's later claim that the care of the self is a political act. Another anecdote from the early 20th century involves the Russian revolutionary Lev Tolstoy's spiritual diary, in which he recorded his daily attempts to live according to his moral principles, rejecting the trappings of wealth and authority. Tolstoy's diary was not merely a personal record. It served as a public testament to an alternative way of living, inspiring others to consider a life of simplicity and non-violence. Foucault's own practice of keeping extensive notes, his habit of writing marginalia in books, and his meticulous archiving of letters all reflect a personal commitment to self-crafting that mirrors these historical precedents. His notebooks become, in a sense, a laboratory of the self, a place where he experiments with the very technologies he theorizes. When we examine the modern therapeutic discourse, we see a convergence of these historical strands. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, draws on the Stoic idea that it is not events themselves that disturb us, but the judgments we make about them. The therapist becomes a guide, much like the Stoic philosopher, helping the patient to reframe thoughts and develop new habits of mind. In a typical CBT session, a patient might be asked to keep a thought record, noting the situation, the automatic thought, the emotion, and the evidence for and against the thought. Over weeks, this practice reshapes the patient's internal narrative, fostering a new sense of agency. This is precisely the sort of technology of the self that Foucault describes. A set of practices that allow the subject to transform himself from within. Similarly, the modern mindfulness movement, popularized by figures such as Jon Kabat-Zinn, frames attention to breath and bodily sensations as a way to be present and reduce suffering. Kabat-Zinn often cites the Buddhist Satipatthana Sutta, which outlines the four foundations of mindfulness: body, feelings, mind, and mental objects. While the Buddhist tradition places this practice within a broader soteriological framework, aiming at liberation from suffering, secular mindfulness strips it of its religious context, presenting it as a technique for stress reduction. Foucault would likely note that this secularization transforms a religious technology into a secular one, altering its ethical implications. The practice remains a technology of the self, but its orientation shifts from a path toward enlightenment to a tool for personal optimization. In the realm of queer activism, the technologies of the self take on a distinctly political hue. The act of coming out, of publicly naming one's desire, is a practice that reshapes both personal identity and social perception. In the early 1980s, when Foucault corresponded with gay activist groups, he observed that the very act of naming one's sexuality functioned as a technology of the self that challenged the dominant heteronormative discourse. By declaring, "I am gay," the individual not only asserts an identity, but also creates a new space within the social field, a space where alternative forms of desire can be articulated and lived. This resonates with Judith Butler's later claim that gender is performative. The repeated act of self-identification produces the very reality it names. Yet Deleuze would caution that focusing too heavily on the act of self-identification risks reifying identity categories, turning desire into a fixed label rather than a fluid force. He would argue that desire should be understood as a productive machine that continually assembles and reassembles, never settling into a stable subject. From this perspective, the technology of the self should aim not at stabilizing a particular identity, but at fostering the capacity to experiment with new modes of being. The tension between these two viewpoints, Foucault's emphasis on reflective self-care and Deleuze's celebration of desire's fluidity, creates a productive dialogue that continues to shape contemporary debates about identity politics and ethical self-formation. Religious ethicists, too, enter the conversation with a different set of concerns. In a 1990 symposium on secular ethics, a theologian named Marie-Claire Dubois argued that the secular self-crafting model neglects the communal dimension of morality. She pointed to the Christian practice of confession as an example of a technology that is both personal and communal. The individual confesses to a priest, but the act is embedded within a community that bears witness and offers forgiveness. Dubois suggested that without this relational context, the self-care practices risk becoming solipsistic, turning ethics into a private affair divorced from the common good. This critique invites us to reconsider whether Foucault's technologies can be resituated within communal practices, perhaps by integrating them with collective rituals, community meditation circles, shared storytelling circles, or group therapy sessions that preserve the relational dimension. The modern mindfulness movement offers a tentative answer. While many mindfulness programs are delivered individually, a growing number of community-based initiatives emphasize shared practice. In the United States, the Mindfulness in Schools program encourages teachers and students to practice together, fostering a collective sense of calm and attentiveness. In India, traditional satsang gatherings bring people together to meditate and discuss spiritual teachings, creating a communal space for self-formation. These examples illustrate how technologies of the self can be embedded within communal structures, mitigating the risk of isolation that religious ethicists warn about. When we consider the practical implications of Foucault's later ethics, we can see how they intersect with contemporary debates about data, surveillance, and digital self-tracking. Today, countless apps invite users to monitor their steps, heart rate, sleep patterns, and even mood. These digital tools constitute a new set of technologies of the self, mediated by algorithms that interpret our data and suggest behavioral changes. A user might receive a notification, "You have been sedentary for 3 hours, consider taking a walk." The app thus becomes a kind of external conscience, guiding the user's self-formation. Foucault would likely see this as a continuation of the historical trajectory he mapped. Power now operates through the self via data, encouraging individuals to govern themselves according to statistical norms. Yet, just as with Stoic self-examination, the user can appropriate these tools for personal empowerment, using the data to reflect, to question, to resist the normative expectations embedded in the algorithm. In this digital context, the counterargument from Deleuze becomes especially salient. If the self is increasingly mediated by algorithmic feedback, does the desire to optimize oneself not become another form of self-discipline? Deleuze would argue that desire should be directed toward creating new assemblages that disrupt these feedback loops, perhaps by hacking the data, by sharing one's metrics openly as a form of collective resistance, or by refusing the quantification altogether. This perspective pushes us to think of technologies of the self not as neutral tools, but as sites of struggle, where the subject can either submit to the logic of the system or subvert it. The religious ethicist's concern about secular self-care also finds resonance here. Some scholars warn that the commodification of self-care, selling mindfulness apps, wellness retreats, self-help books, turns the practice into a marketable product, stripping it of any deeper moral or spiritual grounding. The care becomes a consumption habit, a way to purchase a sense of well-being without confronting the structural injustices that generate suffering. Foucault's insight that the care of the self is inherently political reminds us that ethical self-formation cannot be divorced from the social conditions that shape our lives. The practice must be coupled with a critical awareness of power, a willingness to ask, whose interests does this practice serve? To bring the discussion back to the Collège de France lectures, we recall Foucault's closing remarks in the final lecture of the series. He says, "The art of living is a practice that must be constantly renewed, because the conditions that make us who we are never static." He then invites the audience to consider how the technologies of the self might be employed not only for personal improvement, but for collective emancipation. He asks, if we learn to care for ourselves, can we also learn to care for each other? This question, lingering in the air of the lecture hall, encapsulates the tension that runs through the entire section we are exploring. The interplay between individual self-formation and communal ethical responsibility. In the decades since Foucault's death, scholars have taken his ideas in diverse directions. Some, like Nicolas Rose, have explored the psychologization of governance, analyzing how therapeutic practices become tools of neoliberal governance. Others, like Thomas Herke, have engaged with the Stoic tradition to argue for virtue-based ethics that resonates with Foucault's call for self-crafting. Yet the most vibrant conversations occur at the intersection of these fields, where the practices of mindfulness, psychotherapy, digital self-tracking, and queer activism meet. We find a fertile ground for experimenting with technologies of the self that are both reflective and revolutionary. Let us pause for a moment and imagine a day in the life of someone who deliberately integrates these technologies. In the morning, they begin with a brief meditation, focusing on the breath, noticing thoughts without judgment, a secular echo of the Stoic prosody. After breakfast, they open a digital journal, noting the emotions that surfaced during meditation, perhaps using a CBT thought record template. Midday, they attend a community workshop on queer storytelling, where participants share personal narratives, thereby practicing a collective form of self-examination that also builds solidarity. In the afternoon, they consult a fitness app, not to chase a numerical goal, but to observe patterns in their activity, using the data as a mirror for self-reflection. In the evening, they read a passage from Marcus Aurelius, then compare it to a contemporary essay by Judith Butler on performative identity, noting where the ancient and the modern converge and diverge. Finally, before sleep, they write a short gratitude entry acknowledging moments of care, both for themselves and for the people around them. This routine illustrates how the technologies of the self can be woven together, forming a tapestry that is at once personal, ethical, and political. In closing, the legacy of Michel Foucault's later philosophy invites us to reconsider the very notion of ethics. No longer a set of universal precepts handed down from above, ethics becomes an ongoing practice, a work of self-formation that draws on historical techniques, adapts to contemporary contexts, and remains open to critique from within. The technologies of the self, stoic examen, therapeutic dialogue, mindfulness meditation, digital self-tracking, are not merely tools for personal improvement. They are instruments of resistance, of reimagining who we might become in a world that constantly seeks to shape us. The counterarguments from Deleuze and religious ethicists remind us that this project is contested, that desire, faith, and communal responsibility each offer alternative lenses through which to view the care of the self. By engaging with these tensions, by crossing references to de Certeau's everyday tactics, by listening to the testimonies of activists and scholars, we are invited to participate in an ethical experiment that is as much about living as it is about thinking. The question then remains, in the quiet moments of self-examination, what kind of subject will you choose to become? When we look back across the decades since Michel Foucault first stepped onto the academic stage, it is striking how his ideas have seeped into almost every corner of contemporary thought. One might ask, what is it about his work that continues to reverberate so powerfully? Is it the sheer boldness of his genealogical method, the unsettling way he turned the familiar into the strange, or perhaps the way he reframed power not as a monolithic edifice but as a diffuse network that circulates through everyday practices? In this segment, we will trace the legacy of Foucault's philosophy, examine the critiques that have sharpened its edges, and explore how his concepts are being deployed today in sociology, literary theory, and the digital realm. Along the way, we will pause to hear the voices of his critics, to revisit two pivotal anecdotes that illustrate his influence, and to consider how his insights are being reimagined in the age of artificial intelligence, data sovereignty, and global health crises. Foucault's intellectual lineage can be traced to a constellation of thinkers who each contributed a piece of the puzzle that would become his distinctive approach. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, with his genealogical critique of morality, offered the methodological template that Foucault would later adapt. Nietzsche's insistence that there are no moral phenomena at all, but only moral interpretations, resonated deeply with Foucault's own project of uncovering the historical conditions that make certain truths appear natural. From there, the structuralist tradition, embodied by Claude Lévi-Strauss and Roland Barthes, supplied the tools of discourse analysis and the notion that meaning is produced through systems of signs. Yet Foucault diverged sharply from both, refusing to anchor his analysis in a stable structure or a timeless human nature. Instead, he turned his gaze to the mechanisms of power, knowledge, and subjectivity, weaving them together in a tapestry that he called archaeology and later genealogy. The first major articulation of his genealogical method appears in Discipline and Punish, where he famously opens with the vivid tableau of a public execution in the 18th century, only to juxtapose it with the silent, invisible mechanisms of the modern prison. In the words of Foucault himself, power is not an institution and not a structure, neither is it a certain strength we are endowed with. It is the name that one attributes to a complex strategical situation in a particular society. This insight that power is everywhere, that it operates through the very fabric of everyday life, has become the cornerstone of what scholars now refer to as governmentality. It is this notion that has allowed his thought to travel beyond philosophy departments into sociology, literary studies, and more recently, into the analysis of digital platforms. In sociology, the most direct lineage of Foucault's influence can be seen in the work of Mitchell Rose, whose ethnographic studies of American prisons have taken the panoptic model of surveillance and expanded it into what Rose calls the carceral continuum. Rose argues that the prison is not an isolated institution, but part of a broader network of disciplinary mechanisms that extend into schools, workplaces, and even the home. By tracing the flow of disciplinary techniques, such as constant monitoring, classification, and the normalization of behavior, Rose demonstrates how Foucault's analysis of the panopticon, originally a metaphor for the architectural design of Jeremy Bentham's prison, has become a living framework for understanding contemporary forms of social control. Rose writes, "The prison is a node, not a terminal. It is a site where the techniques of power intersect with the everyday practices of governance." If we shift our focus to literary theory, we encounter another vibrant strand of Foucault's legacy. Roland Barthes, who famously declared the death of the author, was already exploring the relationship between text and reader when he encountered Foucault's ideas. In The Death of the Author, Barthes invokes Foucault's notion of the author function to argue that the author is not a sovereign source of meaning, but a cultural construct that serves specific discursive purposes. This insight opened the door for what later became known as reader response criticism, a field that treats the act of reading as an active, power-laden practice. Scholars such as Stanley Fish have built upon this foundation, suggesting that interpretive communities exercise a form of disciplinary power over texts, determining which meanings are legitimate and which are marginalized. In this way, Foucault's analysis of power relations finds a new home in the very act of literary interpretation. The digital age, however, has perhaps been the most fertile ground for the expansion of Foucault's thought. The rise of what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism has turned the panoptic metaphor into a living, algorithmic reality. Social media platforms, search engines, and data brokers now operate as vast, invisible networks that collect, analyze, and act upon every click, like, and share. When we consider the way algorithms curate our news feeds, we can see a contemporary panopticon in action. Users are simultaneously the observed and the observer, their data feeding back into systems that shape their future behavior. A recent study by the Oxford Internet Institute applied Foucault's panoptic model to the algorithmic recommendation engines of YouTube, demonstrating how the platform's suggested videos function as a self-reinforcing loop of visibility and invisibility, rewarding conformity and penalizing dissent. The researchers concluded that the algorithmic panopticon does not merely watch. It actively produces subjects who internalize the logic of surveillance. A second, equally compelling digital application lies in the concept of biopolitics, which Foucault introduced in his lectures on the history of sexuality and later refined in the History of Sexuality. Volume I Biopolitics refers to the ways in which states regulate the life of populations through health policies, demographic statistics, and the management of bodies. The COVID-19 pandemic offered a stark, real-time laboratory for biopolitical analysis. Governments around the world implemented lockdowns, contact tracing apps, and vaccine mandates, each justified as measures to protect public health. Yet these interventions also revealed the tensions between individual liberty and collective management, a tension that Foucault anticipated. Scholars such as Didier Fassin and Nicolas Rose have argued that the pandemic response exemplifies a biopolitical emergency, where the state's power over life becomes both more visible and more contested. The deployment of digital health passports, for example, can be read through Foucault's lens as a new form of subjectivation, turning citizens into data points that can be granted or denied access to public spaces. To bring these abstract ideas into sharper focus, let us consider two concrete modern examples. First, the analysis of social media algorithms through the panoptic model. Imagine a teenager scrolling through Instagram. Every like, every pause on a story, every comment is logged, transformed into a data point, and fed into a machine learning model that predicts what content will keep the user engaged. The algorithm, in turn, surfaces posts that align with those predictions, nudging the user towards certain cultural trends while obscuring others. In this loop, the user is both the surveilled subject and the source of surveillance data. The algorithmic gaze is not a single, centralized watchtower, but a distributed network of sensors and feedback loops, echoing Foucault's claim that power is everywhere and that, where there is power, there is resistance. The resistance here can be seen in the rise of algorithmic literacy movements, where activists teach users how to audit their feeds, to diversify their sources, and to reclaim agency over their digital selves. The second example turns to the biopolitical analysis of pandemic response policies. In many countries, governments introduced digital contact tracing apps that required citizens to install software on their phones, which would then log proximity events and alert users of potential exposure. While framed as a public health measure, these apps also created a new layer of surveillance that extended into the intimate spaces of daily life. Critics pointed out that the data collected could be repurposed for law enforcement or immigration control, blurring the line between health security and social control. By applying Foucault's concept of governmentality, we can see how the state's management of the population's health became a technique for governing conduct, shaping not only what people do, stay at home, wear masks, but also how they think about risk, responsibility, and citizenship. The pandemic thus illuminated the ways in which biopolitics operates through both material interventions, lockdowns, testing, and discursive strategies, public health messaging, moral framing. These applications are not without their detractors. Eugen Habermas, a towering figure in critical theory, has long challenged Foucault's emphasis on power at the expense of rational discourse. In his seminal work, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, Habermas argues that a truly democratic society requires a space where citizens can engage in rational critical debate, free from the distortions of power. He contends that Foucault's focus on the pervasive nature of power risks eroding the possibility of collective agency, because if power is everywhere, then the very notion of a free public sphere becomes untenable. Habermas writes, the task of the public sphere is to provide a forum for the articulation of common interests, a place where power can be questioned and transformed through reasoned argument. From this perspective, the panoptic analysis of social media could be seen as overly deterministic, neglecting the potential for users to mobilize, critique, and reshape the very platforms that surveil them. A second line of critique emerges from Judith Butler, whose work on gender performativity has intersected with, yet also challenged, Foucault's genealogical approach. Butler acknowledges the power of Foucault's analysis of discourse, but argues that his focus on institutions and structures can obscure the lived experiences of marginalized subjects. In Gender Trouble, Butler writes, the problem with a purely discursive account of power is that it risks reducing bodies to mere sites of inscription, overlooking the ways in which subjects can subvert and re-articulate norms from within. Butler's emphasis on the performative nature of identity suggests that individuals are not merely passive recipients of power but active agents who can reconfigure the meanings attached to their bodies. This critique invites us to reconsider how we apply Foucault's concepts to digital spaces. Are users merely subjects of surveillance, or can they perform resistance through memes, hashtag activism, and the creation of alternative platforms? These debates do not diminish the richness of Foucault's legacy. Rather, they deepen it, prompting us to refine, contest, and expand his ideas. The dialogue between Foucault and his critics has opened up new avenues of inquiry, especially as we confront emerging technologies that were unimaginable in his time. The field of AI ethics, for instance, has begun to draw on Foucault's insights into the relationship between knowledge and power. Scholars such as Safia Noble and Ruha Benjamin have warned that algorithmic decision-making systems encode existing power relations, reproducing biases that marginalize certain groups. By framing AI as a regime of truth, they echo Foucault's claim that knowledge is not for knowing, it is for cutting. In other words, knowledge structures are tools that carve out subjects, define what counts as legitimate data, and determine who gets to speak. Data sovereignty, another pressing issue, resonates with Foucault's analysis of biopolitics. Indigenous activists around the world are demanding control over their own data, arguing that the extraction of digital information by multinational corporations constitutes a new form of colonialism. This struggle can be read through the genealogical lens as an attempt to rewrite the history of data production, to expose the power relations that have historically rendered certain communities invisible, and to reconstitute a new form of subjectivity rooted in self-determination. The emergence of data trusts and community-owned data platforms reflects a biopolitical project to reclaim the governance of life itself, precisely the kind of transformation Foucault anticipated when he spoke of the art of governing. The renewed interest in genealogy as a research method also testifies to Foucault's enduring influence. Genealogy in the Foucauldian sense is not a linear chronology, but a critical excavation of the conditions that make particular truths possible. Contemporary historians and social scientists have adopted this method to interrogate the origins of climate change discourse, the construction of mental health diagnoses, and the development of cybersecurity regimes. By tracing the contingent, often contradictory, histories of these phenomena, scholars reveal how power operates through the production of knowledge, how certain narratives become dominant, and how alternative possibilities are suppressed. To illustrate the lived resonance of Foucault's ideas, let us revisit two historical anecdotes that highlight both his intellectual reach and the way his work has been mobilized in moments of crisis. The first takes us back to 1999, when a conference titled Foucault and the New World Order convened in a lofted conference hall in New York City. Scholars, activists, and policymakers gathered to discuss how the post-Cold War geopolitical landscape was being reshaped by emerging forms of surveillance and control. One of the keynote speakers, a former intelligence analyst, recounted how the U.S. Department of Defense was experimenting with biometric databases to track soldiers' health and performance. He quoted Foucault, noting that the techniques of power have always been coupled with the technologies of the body. The audience, a mix of sociologists, legal scholars, and human rights advocates, debated whether these practices signaled a new biopolitical era, foreshadowing the very debates we now see around facial recognition software and predictive policing. The conference's proceedings were later published in a special issue of Social Science and Medicine, cementing the event as a pivotal moment when Foucault's ideas entered mainstream policy discussions. The second anecdote brings us to the summer of 2020, a year marked by global protests against racial injustice, authoritarian crackdowns, and the looming threat of a pandemic. Across continents, demonstrators invoked Foucault's name in placards, slogans, and online manifestos. In the streets of Paris, a banner read, "Power is everywhere, let's expose it," while in Hong Kong, activists used the term panopticon to describe the city's extensive network of surveillance cameras and facial recognition checkpoints. Academic institutions responded with a surge of seminars and online courses revisiting Discipline and Punish and the History of Sexuality, seeking to equip participants with tools to analyze the mechanisms of state control that were being deployed in real time. A notable example was a virtual symposium organized by the University of California, Berkeley, where scholars from law, anthropology, and computer science examined how digital panopticism was being weaponized to suppress dissent. The resurgence of Foucault's work during this period underscored its relevance. His insights were not confined to the archives of philosophy, but were being wielded as a language of resistance, a way to name and contest the invisible forces shaping everyday life. Returning to the question of how Foucault's legacy continues to evolve, we can see a pattern of reinterpretation that mirrors his own methodological spirit. Each new field that adopts his concepts does not simply copy them. It transforms them, reshapes them, and sometimes even turns them back on the original theory. In the field of digital media studies, for instance, scholars have expanded the notion of the disciplinary society to include what some call the algorithmic society, where governance is performed through code rather than through institutions. In this view, the algorithm becomes a new form of author function, a black box authority that decides what is visible, what is searchable, and what is recommendable. This parallels Barth's claim that the author is a function of the text, but now the function is performed by a machine. The implication is that resistance must also be algorithmic, requiring technical literacy, open-source tools, and collective hacking practices to subvert the logic of surveillance. Similarly, the biopolitical analysis of pandemic policies has opened a dialogue with the field of public health ethics. While traditional bioethics focuses on individual autonomy and informed consent, the biopolitical perspective asks how entire populations are rendered governable through health metrics, risk calculations, and the categorization of citizens as vulnerable or essential. This shift invites a re-examination of the moral foundations of public health interventions, encouraging policymakers to consider not only the efficacy of a measure, but also its implications for the distribution of power and the construction of social identities. In the realm of AI ethics, the concept of algorithmic governance draws directly on Foucault's idea of governmentality. Researchers argue that the deployment of predictive analytics in policing, welfare, and employment constitutes a new form of governmentality through data. By mapping the flow of information, they reveal how decisions that once rested in the hands of human officials are now outsourced to opaque models, thereby diffusing accountability. This raises a critical question. If power is no longer concentrated in a single institution, but is distributed across networks of data, how can we effectively regulate it? Some scholars propose algorithmic accountability frameworks that combine technical audits with participatory oversight, echoing Foucault's call for counter-power that emerges from the very sites of domination. The dialogue between Foucault and his critics also continues to shape contemporary scholarship. Habermas's emphasis on rational discourse has inspired a wave of research into deliberative democracy in digital spaces, seeking to design platforms that facilitate reasoned debate rather than echo chambers. While Foucault warned that where there is power, there is resistance, Habermas reminds us that resistance can take the form of constructive dialogue, not just opposition. This synthesis can be seen in the design of participatory budgeting apps, where citizens engage directly with municipal decision-making processes, thereby turning the panoptic gaze into a collaborative mirror. Butler's performative critique has encouraged scholars to look beyond the structural dimensions of power and to foreground the agency of subjects who enact, subvert, and rewrite norms. In the context of social media, this perspective highlights how users create counter-narratives through memes, viral challenges, and digital art, thereby reconfiguring the meanings attached to surveillance. The rise of digital drag performances, for example, can be read as a performative resistance to algorithmic categorization, using humor and exaggeration to expose the absurdities of data-driven identity construction. Cross-referencing these debates with emerging concerns about AI ethics, data sovereignty, and the renewed interest in genealogy, we see a vibrant intellectual ecosystem in which Foucault's concepts act as both foundation and catalyst. The genealogy of AI, for instance, involves tracing the historical contingencies that led to the dominance of machine learning, examining the Cold War funding of computational research, the corporate capture of academic labs, and the cultural narratives that celebrate automation as progress. By exposing these histories, scholars can reveal the power relations that shape the present, opening space for alternative futures where technology serves democratic ends rather than merely reinforcing existing hierarchies. As we contemplate the future, it is worth returning to one of Foucault's own reflections from his 1978 lecture series on the subject and power. He said, "The individual is not a pre-existing entity. He is a product of the practices that constitute his subjectivity." In the age of digital surveillance, this insight invites us to ask, who are we becoming as we are continuously measured, categorized, and predicted? Are we surrendering parts of ourselves to the algorithmic gaze, or are we learning to navigate, negotiate, and even harness these forces for collective empowerment? The answer perhaps lies in the very tension that has animated Foucault's work from the start. Power is not a monolith to be destroyed, nor is it a benign force to be embraced unquestioningly. It is a set of techniques, a field of struggle, a network of relations that can be both oppressive and productive. By remaining attentive to the historical conditions that give rise to particular forms of knowledge, by listening to the critiques of Habermas, Butler, and others, and by applying these insights to the pressing issues of surveillance capitalism, pandemic governance, AI ethics, and data sovereignty, we continue the genealogical project that Foucault inaugurated. In closing, let us remember that the legacy of Michel Foucault is not a static monument but a living conversation. A conversation that invites us to look closely at the mechanisms that shape our lives, to question the regimes of truth that claim authority, and to imagine new ways of being that resist the subtle, pervasive forces of power. As we move forward, may we carry with us the humility to recognize our own position within these networks, the curiosity to excavate the hidden histories of our institutions, and the courage to imagine alternative futures where power is not merely exercised, but also transformed. The journey is ongoing and the questions remain as urgent as ever. How do we, as individuals and as societies, negotiate the delicate balance between security and freedom, between knowledge and domination, between being observed and being agents of change? The answers will continue to unfold, guided by the critical tools that Foucault so masterfully provided.